Hi, everybody. Welcome to DAM Shootout Cloud versus On-Site. The webinar is intended to give you some information to help you make the best choice about what type of DAM system you will be deploying. My name is David Diamond. I am the Director of Global Marketing for Picturepark. I've been in the DAM industry for a little more than 12 years, and I am the author of the DAM Survival Guide, which was actually just recently released. You can see more at damsurvivalguide.com. With me today, Heath Norton. He is the marketing coordinator for Northern Arizona University. Welcome, Heath. How are you?
I'm great.
Tell us a little bit about your experience now. Heath is representing our on-site deployment today. So tell us a little bit about your system there and at Northern Arizona University, how you use it and all that.
We have a system installed on our server. We have really strong IT support here, so that's really good for us to have it on our own server. We also have we have about 4 terabytes of space, which is pretty substantial, and we have a small marketing group, 5 people that represent 35 sites across Arizona. So we use it a lot to coordinate all our efforts and use all of our shared documents. We try and have them up there in the centralized location so we can all find things. And so far the system is working out great for us.
Okay, and Heath is calling in today from Flagstaff, Arizona, where I understand the weather is beautiful and the city is beautiful. I know I've been there. And sounds pretty good today, Heath, huh?
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Now, representing the cloud side of things, we have Lincoln Howell. He's the Global Director of Vertical Marketing for the Enterprise at Belden. Welcome, Lincoln. How are you?
Doing well, thanks.
Now, so tell us a little bit about your system there at Belden and how you're using it.
So we have had a long history of serving markets that have been very regionally based, and what we've found in recent years is as our customer base becomes more global, we've found that the old system of each different country and region managing their own assets just isn't meeting the needs of our global customers. So we have a management system that is handling our rapidly growing 15,000 unique assets, and it really is the primary driver here is to facilitate the sharing of best practices, the distribution of collateral across each of the global teams, so that we're not reinventing the wheel every time we want to localize a piece of collateral for our customers.
Right. Okay. And I have to ask, and this sort of applies to you too, Heath, because neither one of your organizations are new organizations. I mean, the university has been around and Belden has been around for at least 500 years. And so is it difficult, or for either of you, was it difficult to get your organizations to sort of get into the idea of digital asset management, let alone whether you do cloud or on-site? Was this a tough call?
From our perspective, I mean, we're with the extended campuses portion of the university, which is a little more cutting edge than the traditional university side. Just after spending so much time and kind of analyzing how much time we spend finding assets and how much time we spent and money we've spent to generate collateral and generate photos and do photo shoots, and all of those assets were kind of sitting around on hard drives in places and,
right,
and not in any one centralized location. Just from that perspective, each time we do a photo shoot that was $10,000 to $15,000, and we had maybe 4 or 5 of them sitting around on hard drives, not backed up, not easily searchable. And once I kind of presented that to my boss, it wasn't hard to make the case that we needed something more robust than that. We initially had talked about putting it up on our server, but the more we deal with folders and the structure, it just was not an easy thing for our whole team to use. And kind of, once you go down a path of naming something, if we organize it by fiscal year, then if we want to think about it a different way, then no one could find what they were looking for. So yeah, it was not that difficult to make the case that we needed this.
And what about
Belden? We had the exact same things at Belden as well. It was the exact same problems of finding the assets and the concept of the digital asset management system. They were hungry for it. No problems at all selling that.
Okay, well that's pretty good. So nobody ran into that. If we've dealt with it for so long, we don't need to deal with any kind of a change. So that's kind of a good thing. Okay. Our agenda today, we're going to talk about the good and bad of on-site deployment, the good and bad of cloud deployment. We're going to talk about hosting on-site software, which is something that you'll hear about. We'll describe that in a moment. We're going to talk about some of the points of debate, which is where we have an evolving discussion about the conventional wisdom of what's good or bad about each. Some tips to make a better choice, considerations for the future, and then finally a Q&A session. Now, on your panel on the right-hand side there's a section where you can enter questions. Now, even though we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, you can ask questions at any point as they come to you, and then we will get to those at the end of the session. Now, before we move on, just to clarify exactly what we're talking about, because there's a lot of different words out there that are sort of confusing. When we say on-site, we also mean on-premise. This is another term that's used to describe this. We're talking about software that you have purchased a license for that you run on your own computer, and that's really the end of the contract that you have with the vendor. This, for example, is when you buy a piece of software, you download it, you run an installer, they type a license key in, and then you're off, and then you presume that you can use that software then indefinitely. We'll talk about that type. This is the type that Heath is using. And then we'll talk about cloud software as a service, and this is where you're paying a monthly fee for access, and someone else manages all of the hardware for you. So you just get a connection and you sign in and you do your thing. You could think of Facebook as software as a service, or Gmail, Salesforce. A lot of different enterprise applications are software as a service now. And then the third type that we'll talk about is when you're hosting on-premise software. So this is really, you've purchased a perpetual license as you would with on-site, but now you're paying somebody else to manage it in a virtual instance someplace else. Now this is often referred to as hosted and sometimes referred to as cloud, but we're going to talk about the issues of that and whether that's a good model for you. Okay, so let's get right into what's good about on-site deployment. And this is really easy stuff. You've got total control over the configuration and the access. It's your own system. You can really do what you want within the limitations of the software. You can define who has access to it, just like you would your file servers or anything else. And you can adhere to regulations that affect data storage. And this is important because there are, depending on where you are in the world and what you're trying to do, there are or might be regulations that affect where you're legally allowed to store data. For example, if you work in the healthcare industry in the United States, there are HIPAA regulations that say that you have to store data in a certain way so that the patient has access to that data, so when the data is destroyed, you can absolutely make sure that the data is destroyed. And these are things you can do very easily with on-site, not so easily with cloud. There are also performance improvements for works in progress. So the LAN-based access can be better is better for works in progress because you've got that direct access to all the files that you're working with. And this is particularly a benefit if you're using very, very large files. And the other good aspect is that you've got this cost commitment, right? So you've got one-time purchase, you've got the perpetual use, and if you've lost your budgets, you don't lose your dam system. So the entire initiative is not sort of derailed by that. Heath, what can you tell us? We had some discussions about this. What are some of your thoughts on this stuff?
Well, I think that the primary driver for us was looking at the amount of data that we were going to be storing and looking at our budgets. We're in a very, Arizona's budget is kind of all over the place, and we're very dependent on state funding. Mm-hmm. our budget could be slashed at any time. We don't really have a lot of control over that, how that happens. So after looking at the amount of data that we had, I mean, we had already over 100 gigabytes of data, and looking at the cost commitment and looking at thinking about how we were going to be able to keep our budget, we considered both systems, but we really thought that having it on site was going to be the best system for us, especially when looking at, we talked to our IT team, and we have a very good IT team, which I think was a strong deciding factor, because there's no way our team itself could manage the system. But after talking to them, and we had some server space, so we were basically able to ride on the coattails of server space that was already available. After talking to them, it just made more sense for us to go with an on-site configuration, and our tech team is also, our IT team is very adamant about having control and access to everything. So that was also an important decision-making factor for us over cloud implementation. If we hadn't had our IT team, I would have definitely gone with a cloud system.
Yeah, I was going to say that in my experience, I found a lot particularly in the university environment where there's a lot of concern about feast or famine when it comes to budgets, and usually it's not a feast. So where they're a lot of concern about, like, if I go for an ongoing cost, this could be pulled out from under me at any point in time, and I would have no recourse over it. So there's a concern about that. And then you also mentioned when we talked earlier that you had a chunk of change, you had a budget, a chunk of cash that you could actually use to purchase this system, which is sort of a nice thing also.
Right. Our budget, we had some slack in our budget at that point, so it was definitely the right timing for us to purchase the system. But like I said, that was an excess that wouldn't necessarily be carried out through the next fiscal year or ongoing.
Right.
So having a system that we could just pay a lot of money up front and have the system in place was the best decision for us.
Okay.
Or at least the decision we made.
Right, exactly. And it's not all perfect with an on-site installation. As you mentioned, the maintenance and responsibility is now up to the university. They've got to keep it running. IT has to always be involved, which in his case is okay because he's got a good responsive IT team. But updates can be cumbersome and time-consuming because they have to be scheduled. They have to be coordinated with IT. When a vendor makes a software update available, that might not coincide with the availability of your IT team, and you might find that you're 2 or 3 months away from having a schedule where you can actually get the software update implemented. Probably less of an issue with new software, but much more of an issue if the software is addressing bugs and fixes and that you're waiting for. The fixes themselves can be slower to come with on-site software because with an on-site deployment, when they're working with the development, they've got to, even they get these bugs reported and they've got these fixes coming, they sort of have to roll them out into one-time updates because the actual deployment of an update is not as convenient as just going into your cloud instance and fixing the bug. So you've got to really schedule these things, and as a result, they can be a little bit slower to come. The ongoing maintenance of an on-site system can really rival software as a service as far as cost goes. So that's something to factor in. And if you go off that contract, repurchasing or getting back on contract can be extremely expensive. So even though people think they're going into on-site and there won't be any long-term commitment costs, you really have to factor in, if you don't stay on software maintenance, you will not continue to get updates and you will not continue to get technical support. And if you go off of that contract and you want to go on later on, you might find yourself purchasing the system again, maybe 50% discount, but maybe not even that good. In addition, global access is an issue. If you're looking for a system that is doing mass distribution, on-site's not really ideal because you've got this situation where files are going from your ground into the cloud and then crossing the cloud to someplace else and then going to the ground someplace else. And the cloud to cloud is not so much of an issue, but the cloud to ground and ground to cloud is an issue because this is typically where internet pipes are slowest. So if you've got mass distribution of these, particularly something like a video file where people are streaming, going from the ground to the cloud and back down again is not ideal. And for this reason, if you're doing work in progress workflows, the on-site is great if everybody's on a LAN, but if everybody is distributed, if you've got one work group in Sydney and another work group in Zurich, this is going to be a problem if you're doing this on-site because really you're having to cross these things over the internet. It's not going to work out as well. Heath, did you have any points on any of these that you experienced?
Yeah, I think the maintenance and responsibility is huge for us. I mean, it's something we didn't take lightly based on our past experience with having installed software. We wanted to make sure that we had the IT resources dedicated to this and that we were going to have them available at key times where they could support the system. It always ends up being more than you think it's going to be.
Right.
You know, the updates, we've had some issues when we've done updates that have you know, affected other parts of the system. So we're now doing a test server that we can implement updates on and try. So more to the point is, you know, it's going to take longer for us to update. You know, it's probably a month out before we really get the newest version of something because it has to be applied to our test server.
Right.
There's a lot of commitments from both the IT team and our marketing team that need to be made in terms of testing out how the new version works on the test server and making sure that everything works there. I think one of the things we've ran into there is that you want to be sure when you're looking at a DAM system that if you are going to do a test server environment that that's included as part of your deal and that you know, there's not an extra license or any other fees that will be required to run that.
That's a good point.
Yeah, so we've run into some things there, you know, and that's a lot of time-consuming involvement from both our IT team and our marketing team. But you know, I think having the hardware in place and a good IT team, it still makes sense for us.
Right.
And you know, the contract fees ongoing are also something that we needed to consider, but they were so minimal compared to the initial outlay that from a budgetary standpoint, it just worked much better for us. Okay.
And so let's shift gears and talk about the cloud. So there's, you know, other than maybe social media, there's just no bigger buzzword in the technology industry right now than cloud. You've got easy, affordable startup. This is the sort of the best reputation point of cloud. There's no installation and configuration, which means if you're looking for an ROI, it comes faster because you don't have to deal with all of this stuff. And there are no expensive buy-in requirements. What he talked about, having that big chunk of change to purchase his perpetual license, somebody on the other hand might not have that, and cloud lets them get started for less money. The fixes come faster because if you're a cloud vendor doing software as a service, you pretty much have to make your back-end software work on one computer, and that's yours. So if you've got any kind of a fix you can roll out pretty quickly, you can do that. If it's a critical fix, this is fantastic because you don't have to wait for this scheduled deployment of installers and downloads and testing on all these different machines that your customers run. So the fixes can come much faster. In addition, cloud is not really as hindered by legacy concerns because, again, that central server is owned and managed by the vendor. So they don't have to worry about putting a fix in or putting an update in that's not going to work on older versions of an operating system or older versions of hardware. So the whole cloud model moves a little bit faster than the on-site model. And no software means no burden on IT. So in other words, you can do your DAM system without an IT department or without IT involvement. And you're not really delayed waiting for IT to sort of get on board or approve something for you. So Lincoln, tell us about, with regard to these points, what were you considering when you chose cloud and how relevant were these issues to you?
So when we were making our selection, ultimately we had a few critical issues that we wanted to address. One was we wanted something that would enable some rapid deployment for us. We knew we didn't want this to turn into a 6, 9, or 12-month IT project. We wanted to be able to get in, get it set up, and get it in operation. Additionally, we had a highly distributed series of work groups. So as you mentioned earlier on, for on-site solutions, if we had gone down that path, it would have required multiple on-site solutions to serve each of these individual work groups effectively. And so ultimately, and I guess one additional item here was, as Heath mentioned before, he has a very strong IT group supporting him. We have a strong IT group in our organization, but we've found that, to the points you've made before, it just takes longer than what we wanted to be able to rely on. We knew that, from a marketing perspective, trends in the markets and the need to engage customers and communicate with them effectively, it needs to happen a lot faster than what we can rely on from our IT group. Right. So each of those items really helped drive us toward the cloud solution because, as you've mentioned, it is a far more affordable startup. You're dealing with the software licensing and the initial setup, but you don't have the hardware implications.
Right.
When we look at the faster fixes and faster innovation, that was an element that we looked at and considered it kind of like a lease, where, yes, you buy a lease, and while there are lots of, compare it to a car, there are lots of people that argue that, owning a car is far more economical than leasing it. But the benefit that we were most excited about there was that we knew, especially in a world where technology changes very quickly, that with a cloud-based service, we were going to be able to stay on that leading edge of the technology and make sure that our organization was benefiting from that at that curve rather than on the curve that we might internally adopt it on our local machines.
And this is actually what you and I discussed a week or so ago. Because we both direct marketing, we could really relate to that. The fact that marketing is just, as an industry, is going through an amazing revolution right now with digital technologies. And we kind of, as marketing people, we sort of want to be as free and independent as we can because we really need to move in real time. And there's very few other divisions of an enterprise that need to move at this kind of a pace. So that was... I absolutely related to what you had said there with regard to, having that independence. So, okay, let's go on about the bad in cloud. You've got an internet performance issue. That's just a fact of life, and this can affect the integrity of the dam. The works in progress can be hindered by a slower internet connection. Right? So this means that if you are using your dam for development of files and a Photoshop file, at the end of the day, before it's completed, it's checked back into the dam, and the next day it's checked out again, and then more work is done, and then it's checked in again. If you're on a slow internet pipe, this discourages your users. They get very frustrated by having to download things. The obvious solution to them is they're going to store things locally, right? They're not going to deal with files that are in your dam. They're going to copy them locally and work with them locally. Now, depending on the policies you've got in place for your dam initiative, this can really affect the integrity of the dam, because now what you might think is the most recent version of a file is always inside the dam. This is no longer the case. If that employee forgets to check a file back in and that employee goes on vacation, you have no idea what's going on, and you're at the situation where you're thinking, you know what, we need a digital asset management system to be able to manage this. Also, as we mentioned, budget cuts are an issue, and what I call reverse ROI syndrome is an issue as well. You lose the budget, you lose the cloud. That's just a fact of life. It's like electricity. You have to keep paying for it in order to keep using it. And the reverse ROI issue is that if you've got substantially increased usage of a dam over time, it's liable to cost you more money because there is a cost affected to the bandwidth and the storage of a cloud system, because you're basically, somebody has to pay for this stuff, right? So the vendor is then transferring those costs on to you. And these are long-term accumulative costs. You never make a final payment on a cloud system, right? So it's, as Lincoln mentioned, on a leased car, you keep paying, and at the end of the lease, it's still not your car. right? So tell us about that, Lincoln. What were any of these issues for you?
Yeah, ultimately we have seen in various other systems that internet performance became critical, especially in emerging markets where the internet access may be less reliable. We found that was a concern for us, but ultimately we felt comfortable in being able to work through which user groups had that access to the system and making sure that they had the appropriate bandwidth to be able to maximize their usage of this cloud-based system. Right. As it relates to local storage becoming a bad solution, I completely agree with that. It has been a large concern for us because not only would they make a local version of some of these assets, but then they would modify it and edit it and then share it with their peers who would then further modify it. And we would get multiple generations of these assets that would go through unauthorized modifications. At the end of the day, I don't know that we'll ever change that behavior of making local copies. But what we did feel comfortable with was we found a DAM solution that enabled notification of all of the consumers of these assets when a relevant asset becomes updated and is available. So that was an alternative that we felt comfortable to offset the risk of local storage and distribution of outdated assets. From a budget cut perspective, we kind of stepped back and looked at it and felt like no matter what system we run with, we'll always have ongoing costs. It's a cost of business, it's a cost of playing in this space, and it's a cost of having your technology and your communications vehicles at your fingertips. So we were less concerned about the risk of budget cuts. I think the real area where we're most concerned is clearly there's always that risk of increased usage. Frankly, I would consider that to be a good problem. And if we reach a point where we reach a tipping point where that usage might justify more on-site solutions, we'll definitely consider that. But for now, we feel very comfortable that the economics and the ongoing costs of our cloud-based solution are really hitting the mark for us.
Okay, that sounds fair. Let's shift gears just for a moment and talk about the hosting of on-site software. So this is where you're buying a perpetual license and then you're paying somebody else to manage this in an instance someplace. So I'll just make a few quick points about this because I think they're very important. If you go down this road, these are all the costs of software as a service and on-site. And if you do a long-term, even a 5-year projection, this is by far the most costly option that you will have for digital asset management. So if you are going this route, you really have to have a good reason for going this route because it's not economical. You have none of the work in progress benefits of on-site, and you have none of the scalability benefits of software as a service. So you can put any software you want in a quote-unquote cloud instance, but it does not make it software as a service or cloud software. All right, so this is an important point. You're making payments to multiple companies, which of course is required because you've got one company that's providing the software and another company that's providing the hosting services. And this is a complex responsibility trail. So if something goes wrong, if you can't get access and one company is saying it's working on our end, maybe you talk to your hosting provider and the hosting provider says all of our other customers are happy, talk to your DAM vendor. This is an issue there too. And on-site software running in a virtual machine is not cloud or software as a service. So don't be fooled by this. When you are speaking to vendors and they say they have a cloud solution or a cloud option, make sure that you know specifically if this is on-site software that you are running in a cloud instance or software as a service. One of the best ways of telling that is the upfront costs. If you're purchasing what is really on-site or perpetually licensed software, you're going to have a huge upfront cost in addition to your monthly costs there. So that's just some points I wanted to make there. Look at some of the debates that are going on about this stuff. With security, this is a popular one. Each option presents security advantages and challenges. Okay? Most common with cloud, people say we don't want to go with cloud because it's a shared system and this makes us nervous. Conversely, a bigger security risk can come from on-site software that is misconfigured. So nobody intended the software to become publicly accessible, but it was because an administrator didn't have the expertise that the vendor who's managing a software as a service system does, and therefore left his or her system wide open I've seen this happen in the past, and it is definitely a security consideration. The performance issue, the local area network is fast, but then look at YouTube. YouTube is fast too, right? So work in progress likes a LAN, but distribution likes the cloud. That's kind of my little mantra about this stuff. You have to think about not so much where the assets start, but where they end up. If you use a digital asset management system primarily for managing works in progress, yeah, you're probably going to want an on-site system right now. However, if you're thinking about distribution, if it's about getting your assets into the hands of others in a controlled way that doesn't bottleneck your own network throughput, then cloud is ideal. On the rent versus own subject, forget thinking that one option doesn't have ongoing costs. They both have ongoing costs. Ask anybody who has purchased a home if there are no ongoing costs of ownership. There are always going to be those. So factor those in carefully when you're comparing one to the other. And remember, those support contracts that you get for on-site, these can be financial handcuffs because they are not only a relatively expensive percentage of the purchase price, but if you go off those contracts, it can be expensive to get back in. On the point of debate for costs, here's a little sort of example based on $20,000 digital asset management system over 5 years, and this does not include staff. Now, these prices here are based on sort of an average that I got from looking around at different DAM vendors and what they were charging for different things, and then I rounded up and came up with something that was pretty, what I thought, pretty even keel across vendors. An on-site with ongoing maintenance, at the end of 5 years, the $20,000 DAM ended up costing $56,000. And this was allowing for $35,000, which is $7,000 a year for hardware costs. This comes out to about $50 a day. On the cloud side, of course, we have to say that there's 100 gigabytes of storage and 20 gigabytes of traffic. This is not really a lot, but this is I would say pretty much a standard for people who are getting started. The software ends up costing $93,600. And of course, there's zero hardware costs. This is $51 a day. Now, before we go on, I want to particularly ask Heath about this, because when I've shown these numbers to people, usually the first thing that people come back with is that $7,000 a year for hardware. This is crazy. We would never spend that much money on hardware. So Heath, tell us about the SAN at Northern Arizona University. How much it costs and how often do you replace it?
Yeah, our cycle is, I believe, every 5 years. We're supposed to be redoing our SAN, and the numbers they told me for the amount of storage we needed was $50,000. So yeah, luckily, those hardware costs were already included with the overall organization costs, so we didn't have to eat those costs directly. But if we weren't so fortunate, we would definitely be incurring a lot of costs in hardware.
And this is just what you're talking about here is $10,000 a year just for the device that you store files on. So this is not the cost of the file server. This is not the cost of network cards, computer memory, or anything else that's required to run, even the electricity that's required to run these things on site. So that $7,000 a year is really, really generous. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that when it comes down to costs, don't think about the cost of getting into the digital asset management system. Think about the ongoing cost of ownership for the digital asset management system. And the reason that I encourage people to look at a 5-year time frame is if you're looking at a time frame that's any less than 5 years, don't even waste your time with digital asset management. That's just not the point. The point for this is to have an ongoing resource that builds over time. So the 5-year cost projection is really, I think, a minimum that you should look at before making those decisions. Okay, some tips to make the best choice. And these are really tough because you'll see from going through these, it's really difficult to say what the best choice is because it's going to be your system that really makes the difference and your needs that really make the difference. This one's easy. I have no IT resources. The cloud comes with an IT team that knows the software and supplies the computers and other hardware. This is also an advantage when we talked about a moment ago about the security. Your software as a service vendor knows the software. So when that software is deployed, they can check on the software. They can check your configurations. They can make sure that things are sort of in place there so your system is secure. Conversely, my budget can be unreliable. Cloud is a rental. You stop paying and you lose access, so keep that in mind. Also keep in mind the on-site maintenance contract. If you need total lockdown security, breaches are always possible regardless of what system you go. How do you deploy it? Focus on the prevention, obviously, but then decide what happens after a breach. And this is important because what I mean by this is if you're in a situation where you need the flexibility to fire your provider and move on to somebody else after a security breach, cloud is great because you can fire a cloud provider. You can say you're in breach of our contract. You did not provide us with the security we needed. We want out of the contract and we're going to go with someone else. Conversely, if you're on site, can you fire your own IT department? Probably not. So it's something to consider there. On the other hand, people would say, well, if I do have a security breach, I want to know that we have control over the changes made in the IT department. Do either of you guys have any comments on any of these three things?
I'd like to throw a little something in about the security because clearly having secure assets was critical for us, and ultimately it boils down to a comfort level of, who do you trust to own that security? There's a lot of people out there who feel like, if I really want to trust the security, I have to do it myself. But another line of thinking that we found ourselves in is that, especially with cloud-based services, it's similar in the financial industry as well. Security is everything to them, and so we found that, for organizations, for business models that will be completely gone, they'll go out of business if they suffer security breaches. That's going to be top of mind always, and so we found a lot of comfort in a cloud-based solution, knowing that security is something that they took seriously, because if they didn't, they would no longer have a business.
That's a good point. Okay, let's go on to another screen of tips. I need to integrate with. Cross-domain integration where you're going from the cloud to the ground is possible, but performance can be an issue there, and complexity usually increases because you've got firewall issues, you've got TCP/IP issues, you've got the cloud vendor dealing with your IT department. So if you're looking at integrations, what I would recommend is look at the systems you want to integrate with and where are they. If they are in the cloud, then maybe a cloud instance might be a good idea for you. If they're on the ground, an on-site deployment might be good. If you do need bugs fixed right now, if you're on-site and you're willing to pay, on-site patches might be available, assuming that the vendor's software infrastructure enables them to distribute a patch. Some DAM systems do not support patching. They will only be able to work with putting out new installers and having to take down the server and reinstall the server, and this can be very time-consuming and very cumbersome. Cloud systems, as we mentioned, are typically updated more frequently, particularly if there is a really serious bug. You can get a fix in a cloud system very, very quickly. So that's maybe before most customers even notice that it was an issue. If your workflows are mainly work in progress, as we mentioned, the cloud uploading and downloading is just going to encourage users to store locally. So you can combat this with policy by just saying you're not allowed to, but honestly, at some point in time, if policy does not enable people to get what they want done and it just stands in their way, they will rebel against that policy. If you are a high-traffic, high-volume site, the usage, bandwidth, and storage are extra for cloud, and you have to keep that in mind. Now, as Lincoln mentioned, this is a good problem to have because it means that your DAM system is getting used. But if your budgets are really restricted, it might not be a problem that you can afford. So it's you don't want to necessarily get into a situation where you're telling people they can't upload into the DAM because you can't afford it anymore. If you need work in progress and fast distribution, think about a hybrid DAM. So there are systems where you can have something working on the ground, and then for some data and for other data, you can move it into the cloud for distribution. If you need to adhere to regulations, ask your IT and DAM vendors about compliance. This is super important, particularly if you are working in a field where there is data sensitivity, because you don't want to buy a system and then find out that you are in breach of some compliance because you're just simply using your system. A public cloud, which is what we sort of assume is like with the Amazon and Microsoft Azure and these other systems, this might not be an option for some data. And again, think about the hybrid solution there, because you might be able to protect some stuff on the ground and then put other stuff into the cloud. Any thoughts on those points, guys?
We definitely have some regulations in terms of our data. We have to meet with FERPA regulations for student information, which means that we have to keep control of all of our data. It's federal regulations that we have to comply with. So by having the system in-house, it definitely made the pill easier to swallow, and it was easier for us to get it past our purchasing department. Otherwise, if we were cloud hosted, there might be some data that we would have to be more careful with posting up there. We would have to be a little more discerning in what data went up there, and be sure that none of our student data actually went up there. For example, testimonials or those kind of things. Those couldn't be uploaded into the system if we had any kind of student data on there. But with having it internally, this fits with the FERPA rules, and we're able to do that, and not worry about, oh, this can go in the DAM, that can't, type of things, which we wanted to have all of our data in one location, and that was the point of the whole system. So, so that was a consideration for us as well.
Okay. Yeah, I thought when I did some research on this, I found it very interesting. On some of the regulations, it wasn't even so much about where the data can be stored. It had to do with when the data was destroyed, you had to absolutely make sure the data was physically destroyed. And the problem with this on a cloud thing is if you've got a cloud version of your software, say for example it's running on Amazon's cloud services, you can go to Amazon and say delete my account, but what you can't do is go to Amazon and say delete my account and zero out all of the hard drives that stored my data so that I can be in compliance with this law. And Amazon is in fact so aware of this that they're now developing a different cloud that so far is only available to government resources, but enables that sort of private cloud aspect where you really can have absolute control over how data is handled and how data is disposed of. Okay, let's look at some considerations for the future before we get into our Q&A here. The cost of storage and bandwidth, you can expect these prices to drop. They have for over 10 years, and there's no reason for us to expect that they won't. If this is a big hindrance or aversion to the cloud, this is really something to consider because, again, we're talking about that 5-year time period. And as Lincoln had mentioned, this is a good problem to have if the DAM system usage is increasing over time, because it means that the system is successful. With the network performance for the works in progress stuff, again, I mean, we're streaming HD video into our living rooms now, and this is not something we would have imagined doing 5 years ago. So I figure at some point in time, at least to a business, that the network throughput gets to the point where that work in progress from the cloud is not as big of a hindrance as it is today. And then more importantly, I think, is to look at the vendor trends in digital asset management. The vendors who offer on-site systems cannot ignore the cloud. This is just a fact of life. Many of them are toying around with the idea and saying, oh, we're going to have a solution, or we're going to go in that direction at some point in time, or we think it's important, or whatever. Conversely, you're not seeing the vendors who are cloud-based talking about that they're going to be moving their systems on-site. It's just sort of an unspoken trend that things seem to be moving in the direction of cloud. Now, this is going to be a transition period, so it's not something that's going to happen overnight, but it is something to consider there. So before we get to Q&A, I got to ask Lincoln and Heath, from our discussion today and from what you've learned since you deployed your systems, we'll start with Lincoln. Would you consider switching to an on-site system?
Right now, I would say that we would consider it based on our usage, because as you mentioned, the bandwidth and the storage that you use on a cloud-based system is a primary driver of those fees. So if we reach that point where an on-site system makes more economic sense, then we would. Mm-hmm. But that being said, we would probably lean toward more of a hybrid approach, because we have really come to appreciate and rely on the cloud benefits.
Right. Okay. What about you, Heath? Would you ever go to the cloud?
I think if our IT support lessened, also, if we had less IT resources or that became troubled in some way, we would definitely think about switching to the cloud. Also, as the storage costs kind of come down in a cloud system, I think it starts making more and more sense for us. But I think it's going to have to come back quite significantly just because of how much data we have up there. And with our current implementation of a small local team, I think if it were to expand out somehow, if we were to start having more people across the state, I think it might also make a cloud system more of an option for us.
Right. So but no regrets about the decisions you've made?
The only regret I would have is that we're not dealing with the latest and greatest. In any kind of immediate fashion. We're usually a month out in terms of getting our updates and enjoying the latest features, which is, unfortunate, but a lot of the newer features are not so critical to our operations, so it's kind of like a, it'd be nice to have, but isn't a make or break for us.
And what about you, Lincoln? Any regrets?
No regrets so far.
Okay, that's fair enough. Just one slide about Picturepark before we get to the Q&A. Picturepark is a digital asset management vendor. We offer systems for the cloud, on-site, and hybrids, so you can choose what's best, change your mind, or leverage both of them. Picturepark was founded in Switzerland in the year 2000. We have offices in Aarau, San Francisco, Vienna, and India. The partner network reaches other places, and it's growing very fast. An innovative approach to DAM. I'm sorry, I was about to do a shout out to somebody in the audience who just became a partner this morning, and I thought, no, that's actually not inappropriate. But you know who you are. I'm glad you're here. I can't wait to announce it. An innovative approach to DAM that is designed to work with the applications you use. This is some of the applications that there are standard integrations for Picturepark, and there are many other custom integrations, K4, SAP, a number of other applications that you can make work with Picturepark. Okay, the Q&A here. Before we get into the Q&A, I want to thank Heath and Lincoln for your input on this and for working with me on this. You've just been fantastic to work with. So I really, really appreciate that, guys. And let's now look at some questions here. So let me open up our panel here and look at our questions. Here, yes, we have a number of questions here. We've got from Carl, is on-site maintenance always required? I thought that was an option. Carl, on-site maintenance is not always required. With some vendors, they actually include that in their first year, but it is technically an option after that. But if you don't pay for the on-site maintenance, you won't continue to get updates, and you won't continue to get the technical support. So that is a consideration there. From Alenka, we have, do cloud providers really turn off the system if you stop paying? Don't I own that data? You actually do own that data, Alenka, but it really depends on your contract with the provider. Nobody is going to just turn off your access without warning you. So this is likely going to be an ongoing conversation, and you can expect that it might be coming if you stop paying for that. But there's a difference between ownership of data and access to that data, right? So it's kind of like you buy a storage unit in some commercial space, and you put all your stuff in there, and then you stop paying for it. Well, they're going to lock the stuff until they get their payment, and then you can kind of get it from there. Here's one for Lincoln from Clyde. If your IT was more available, do you think you would have chosen on-premise? What do you think, Lincoln?
You know, we considered that. Ultimately, our IT system, our IT team is, you know, I wouldn't call them unavailable, but I would say that it's more of the timeline. And, you know, as I look at the various IT projects that we have, as rapidly as we would like to believe a particular project could occur, it always took at least twice as long as we ever imagined when dealing with our own internal IT team. And we found that working with the cloud-based system really did enable a rapid deployment that far exceeded anything that we've seen internally. So it is accessible. I think there are just some dynamics of internal IT teams and the other projects that they're simultaneously balancing that lends us to prefer the cloud solution.
Okay. All right. We've got Michelle asks, why do you say it takes longer for on-site vendors to release fixes, and what about downloaded updates? Okay, Michelle, this actually has to probably more than you want to know about software development. But again, when you're doing on-site deployment, everything is based on an installer. So building an installer is not really a trivial issue. It's a lot of R&D effort because these installers, as simple as they are for users, these are really doing a lot of stuff in the background. So even when a small fix is available, an on-site vendor can't just distribute that to the world because they've got to do it in this format. So typically, they'll know about one bug and they'll fix it and it'll be in the code base, and then they will basically schedule a release 3 or 4 months out that includes all of these fixes. But these fixes, even though they're technically available, are not available to the users because they have not been deployed into installers yet. So this is one of the issues that we talk about there. Okay, let's see here. Let's go on to the next one. This is for Heath from Akira. Does your IT department, this is a good one actually, does your IT department charge you for the use of their systems? I wonder how those costs are accounted for.
Luckily, those are just rolled up into our overall extended campus's costs. They don't charge us back for the things because they're such an integral part of extended campuses itself. There's been talk of doing some sort of cost allocation like that, but luckily that hasn't happened yet. But I think if they were billing us back, it would also be a little better comparison with cloud. We would be thinking a little bit more about a cloud system if we were having to pay for IT resources, right, because it is taking up a pretty significant chunk of our IT people's time at any, not on a regular basis, but when we do updates or when we do have a problem, it can be a good chunk of their time. Right.
Yeah. And so here's Adrienne is asking Heath, does your university have regulations against the cloud?
Regulations against the cloud? No, not per se. No, I wouldn't. There was no regulations against the cloud specifically. Like I said, there was some FERPA concerns that we had,
right,
with some items that we could put up there, but most of our things that we have up in our system do not have student information in them, which is the big concern with the university.
Okay.
So the majority of our items wouldn't fall under that kind of regulation, so there's not really any anything against the dam in terms of regulations.
Right. Okay.
Cloud, excuse me.
Understood. And then Daniel is asking, in the cloud setting, what happens to all of the assets if the dam provider goes under or a decision is made to switch vendors? Is the dam typically mirrored locally on a RAID? Daniel, this really, again, it depends on the contract that you've got with the dam vendor. That is a really good point, that if a dam vendor goes under, in other words, you've got that something has gone into bankruptcy court or something along these lines, your data can just end up being locked away while this is all being battled out. So this is a real concern. If you are going to go with a cloud system, make sure that it is a reputable vendor there. And with regard to switching vendors, it really has to do with the access that you have to your data. If you have the ability to export your data locally, and then you could then import that into another DAM system, that's probably the best option to have. Make sure if you go into a cloud system that there is the ability to get at your data. And to answer your question about the data mirrored locally to a RAID, I would say that is not typical, but it could be possible. Again, you have to talk about the infrastructure of the data system. If they have an API that would enable you to mirror to another system. I know in some cases people actually do a cloud-to-cloud mirroring. So from company A, they will mirror their data to company B with the presumption that if company A goes out of business, that company B will still have their data going on there. Casey asks Lincoln, does your IT even know you've launched your DAM? Are they okay with it? Is this a secret project, Lincoln, or do they know what you're doing?
Yes, they do know about it. In fact, interestingly, there are other applications throughout our organization that are also pursuing some similar applications for different workflows for engineering documents and things outside of our marketing database. And ultimately, they were pushing very strongly for a one-size-fits-all, super system that handled everything. And ultimately, once again, it just was turning into one of those 2-year projects that we said, if we can get one of those super systems up and running, that's fine, but we can't afford to wait and delay getting our message in front of customers while we develop that. In the meantime, we're going to deploy a cloud-based system that will enable rapid deployment, that distributed access that we were needing, and then, so we stay very close with them, and they understand the needs that these super systems aren't meeting for us.
Okay. And Razik asks, I love this question. Even if network bandwidth improves, don't you assume LAN access will always be the faster option? This is a great point because technically I would assume that. But here's the thing, Razik. Think about computer processing. When people are going out to buy new computers today as opposed to even 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago, when you ask them why they're getting a new computer, it's not usually because they're saying, I need something that's faster. Because we've really gotten to the point where our processors are really, how fast do you type, right? Unless you're doing 3D or you're doing some very, very processor-intensive task, most of our even generic computers are perfectly fast today. I expect the same thing to happen with network bandwidth, where at some point in time, we can say, well, the LAN is actually faster, but for the purposes of what we're doing, it's absolutely fast enough to come in off the pipe, off the internet. So I think that that's a great point there. And we're pretty much out of time. Lorna is asked, can you explain the hybrid system a little bit more? Yeah, this is basically what this is, Lorna, is you basically have two systems. You have an on-premise or an on-site system, and you have the cloud system. And these two systems are linked to one another. So what happens is when you're manipulating metadata or assets on site, you can flip say it's a checkbox that you click that you say distribute to the cloud. And then you save the record and then that's all you do. And in the background, the system then takes that information and propagates it into your cloud system where it's then available for deployment worldwide. So that at that point it's on the other side of your DMZ and your firewall, and it's accessible worldwide, and there's not a security issue. And so that's kind of the hybrid approach there as opposed to one system doing both. Okay, we are just past the top of the hour, and there are questions that we did not get to. I apologize for that, and we will answer those questions and comments in private email to those people. We will send a link to this webinar to everybody so that you will have that. And once again, to Heath and Lincoln, thank you very, very much for all your assistance on this. And to everybody who attended today, I appreciate that. And we will talk with you in the future at another webinar. Thanks for coming. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.